1/3 November 24, 1944. Northfield, Tinian and Elliefield, Saipan. The 21st Bomber Command launches 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses toward the Japanese mainland. Brigadier General Wood Hansel commands the American Strategic Bombing Force from his headquarters on Guam. Silver bombers carrying 277 tons of bombs against the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant on Tokyo's outskirts. What Japanese fighter pilots discover this morning will shatter their understanding of aerial warfare and reveal a technological gap that no amount of courage or determination can overcome. Captain Tatsuya Yamada adjusts his oxygen mask in the cockpit of his Kawasaki Ki-81 Hayate at Chofu Airfield outside Tokyo. The morning briefing emphasized intercepting enemy bombers with maximum altitude advantage. Intelligence reports indicate large four-engine bombers operating from newly captured Mariana Islands bases flying at unprecedented heights. Yamada volunteers for the high-altitude interception mission that promises difficult combat against an enemy whose capabilities remain largely unknown. His aircraft carries four 12.7 mm machine guns and two 20 mm cannons, weapons designed for combat at conventional altitudes where Japanese fighters excelled. The altitude challenge emerged from Japan's limited experience against American heavy bombers in China during early 1944. Those B-24 Liberators and older B-7 Flying Fortresses operated at altitudes Japanese fighters could reach, typically between 20,000 and 25,000 feet. Major Tishimeta had developed specialized climbing tactics based on those encounters, emphasizing gaining altitude before engagement rather than climbing during combat. A pilot already at altitude possessed energy advantages that could overcome defensive armament. But the morning's intelligence reports suggested these new bombers operated far higher than anything previously encountered. The 21st Bomber Command represents America's most powerful Pacific strategic deployment since the Diddle Raid of 1942. The command would eventually total over 1,000 aircraft operating from 5 major airfields across Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, with pressurized cabins designed specifically for extreme high-altitude operations over vast Pacific distances. This construction philosophy differed fundamentally from previous American bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator used unpressurized crew compartments that required heavy flight suits and oxygen masks, limiting their effective operational ceiling to around 25,000 feet. American designers prioritized altitude capability in the B-29, accepting complexity in exchange for operational sanctuary above enemy interceptor range. The pressurization system allowed crews to work in shirt sleeves at altitudes where unpressurized aircraft crews would struggle with cold and hypoxia. Yamada's formation includes Ki-61 Hayate from the 244th Century and Nakajima Ki-84 Shoki interceptors from the 47th Centi, climbing desperately from multiple airfields around Tokyo at maximum sustainable rate. The Japanese pilots observe contrails forming at extreme altitude where American formations approach from the southeast. Radar operators at the Chiba Detection Station identify the incoming formation at 27,000 to 31,000 feet, varying their altitude as they navigate weather conditions. Ground controllers vector defending fighters toward the threat axis, but the climbing interceptors struggle to reach even 25,000 feet before the bombers arrive, over target. The technological disparity becomes immediately apparent as opposing forces attempt engagement for the first time. Yamada flies an aircraft designed in 1941 for medium-altitude combat against Chinese and early Pacific War opposition. His Ki-61 weighs 7,650 pounds lb with a 1,175 horsepower Kawasaki HR-40 liquid-cooled engine providing 368 miles per hour maximum speed at 16,400 feet. While specifications claim a service ceiling of 36,000 feet, actual combat performance degrades severely above 28,000 feet. The engine loses power dramatically in thin atmosphere, while control surfaces become increasingly sluggish. Self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor had been incorporated following combat experience, adding weight that further reduced altitude performance. The Ki-44 interceptors from the 47th Centi attempt reaching the bomber formation, which varies between 27,000 and 30,000 feet altitude depending on weather conditions. These fighters, specifically designed for high-altitude interception with superior climb rates, struggle desperately in the thin atmosphere. Engines overheat while producing a fraction of their sea-level power, and pilots gasp through inadequate oxygen systems that were designed for shorter engagements at lower altitudes. The interceptors manage to reach 28,000 feet before most begin stalling, still thousands of feet below many of the bombers. Those few fighters that achieve sufficient altitude lack the energy for sustained engagement. Control surfaces barely respond in rarefied air while engines strain beyond design limits. The B-29s maintain formation integrity at their operational altitude. Crews working comfortably in pressurized compartments without the heavy flight suits or cumbersome oxygen masks that handicapped previous bomber operations. Captain Robert Morgan commands the lead superfortress Dauntless Doy as navigator Captain Theodore Vancerk identifies the primary target through the Norden bomb site. The bomber's 4 Wright 350 engines generate 2,200 horsepower each, maintaining over 300 miles per hour true air speed at operational altitude despite the thin air. Turbo superchargers compress the thin atmosphere, maintaining engine power where naturally aspirated engines fail. The pressurized compartments connect through a tunnel over the bomb bays, allowing crew movement without altitude suits. This design enables sustained operations at altitudes previously impossible for combat aircraft. The central fire control system coordinates defensive armament through analog computers, tracking multiple targets simultaneously, while gunners operate from comfortable positions. Yamada pushes his K-61 to absolute ceiling, the airspeed indicator showing barely 180 miles per hour as the fighter wallows in thin atmosphere approaching 30,000 feet. His pre-war training never anticipated combat at such altitudes. The mission briefing emphasized attacking from above using diving passes to maintain energy, but reaching position above the bombers proves impossible. Japanese doctrine developed against unescorted B-17s and B-24s operating at moderate altitudes proves completely inadequate. The high-end sustains 30,000 feet for mere seconds before stalling, forcing recovery that costs 3,000 feet of altitude. Multiple attempts achieve similar results as engine temperature gauges exceed redline limits and oil pressure fluctuates dangerously. Yamada observes bomber contrails passing overhead, their defensive guns tracking his fighter but not firing due to extreme range. The altitude gulf prevents any meaningful engagement despite desperate Japanese efforts and early warning of the raid. That morning, only 40 Japanese fighters managed to make any attacks on the bomber formation, most achieving just single firing passes before losing energy. Machine gun rounds fired in climbing attacks lose velocity rapidly in thin air, many falling short of targets. The few fighters reaching effective firing position possess insufficient energy for sustained engagement, managing only brief bursts before stalling away. Anti-aircraft shells explode thousands of feet below the bombers despite maximum elevation settings on the guns. The largest Japanese anti-aircraft weapons can theoretically reach 30,000 feet, but accuracy at such altitudes proves virtually impossible. The November 24 raid marks the first mass B-29 attack on Tokyo since the symbolic Diddle raid 31 months earlier. The formation maintains course toward the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant, Japan's most important aircraft engine manufacturing facility. Chief Bombardier Lieutenant Coleman releases his bombs on signal, followed by other aircraft dropping in sequence from their varying altitudes. Due to powerful jetstream winds discovered at altitude reaching over 200 miles per hour, only 24 aircraft hit the primary target with others bombing secondary targets or missing entirely. Yet the psychological impact proves profound. The bombs fall from unprecedented altitude while Japanese fighters circle helplessly below, unable to reach the attackers. Ground observers watch vapor trails crossing Tokyo's sky at previously unimaginable altitude beyond reach of defending fighters. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka coordinates fighter operations from sector control, receiving frustrated reports from interceptor squadrons. Pilots report engines failing, controls becoming ineffective, and inability to sustain altitude necessary for interception. The bombers proceed through Japanese airspace, suffering only one loss to a ramming attack by a damaged fighter in a suicidal gesture of desperation. Defending pilots expend fuel in futile climb attempts, most returning to base without ever reaching firing range. The technological superiority displayed shocks Japanese military leadership and pilots alike. The 21st Bomber Command concludes its first Tokyo mission with minimal damage from defenses, though mechanical issues force several B-29s to divert or ditch in the Pacific. Japanese fighters claim only one confirmed victory through ramming, while bomber gunners claim 5 Japanese fighters destroyed. The altitude sanctuary contradicts every Japanese expectation based on intercepting lower-flying bombers from China bases. This operational failure stems from fundamental misunderstanding of American bomber capabilities and the revolutionary nature of the B-29's design. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Gender observes B-29 operations from Naval Headquarters, analyzing Army fighter failures with growing concern. His intelligence. 2/3 reports emphasize the unprecedented bomber altitude that exceeds Japanese interceptor capabilities by significant margins. Even the Navy's latest fighters cannot effectively engage at such heights. The strategic implications suggest requirements for completely new aircraft designs or alternative defensive methods. But Japan lacks time and resources for such development. The intelligence failure reflects limited technical information about American pressurization technology and turbo-supercharged engines. Innovations that transformed high-altitude operations. Japanese planning had assumed enemy bombers would operate at conventional altitudes below 25,000 feet. Based on all previous experience, the B-29's pressurized cabin concept remained poorly understood by Imperial military analysts who failed to grasp its implications for combat operations. Previous American bombers operating from China bases flew at altitudes Japanese fighters could reach, reinforcing these assumptions. December 3, 1944 brings another concentrated B-29 attack against Tokyo with 86 aircraft targeting the same Musashino plant. The Japanese response evolves based on the November experience. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the elite 244th Senti implements new tactics, positioning his fighters at maximum altitude before the bombers arrive, hoping to dive on them with energy advantage. But even starting from optimal position, the Ki-61s cannot reach bomber altitude. The formation includes specially modified interceptors with reduced armor, removed radios, and minimal ammunition to save weight. These stripped fighters achieve marginally better altitude, but still fall short of effective engagement height. Lieutenant Saburo Hayashi leads a specialized ramming unit called Hagakuurtai, formed from volunteer pilots willing to sacrifice themselves. The unit's aircraft strip all unnecessary weight, including most armament and armor protection, carrying only enough fuel for one-way missions to achieve maximum altitude. The modified Ki-61 fighters climb toward the approaching formation with emergency boost engaged, accepting certain engine damage. Manifold pressure exceeds manufacturer limits while cylinder head temperatures approach failure point. Pilots breathe pure oxygen for 30 minutes before takeoff, but the inadequate oxygen systems still cause hypoxia symptoms during extreme altitude attempts. Most fighters stall around 30,000 feet, still below effective engagement altitude. Sergeant Masaoki achieves 31,500 feet in his lightened Ki-61 before attempting a ramming attack against a straggling B-29. The bomber's defensive guns fire continuously as the fighter approaches from below in a zoom climb. Multiple 50 caliber rounds strike the Ki-61, but Itaki maintains his collision course. At the last moment, his fighter loses energy, stalling 500 feet below target before entering an uncontrollable spin. The pilot recovers at 20,000 feet, his aircraft too damaged and lacking fuel to attempt another climb. The ramming attacks achieve occasional successes when bombers descend due to mechanical problems, but cannot systematically counter the high-altitude threat. Through December 1944, B-29 losses remain minimal while Japanese cities begin suffering strategic damage. The defending pilots experience profound frustration, watching their homeland attacked while remaining powerless to intervene effectively. Traditional samurai warrior spirit proves meaningless against technological barriers preventing combat engagement. Pilots report feelings of helplessness and shame at their inability to protect Japan despite willingness to sacrifice their lives. Major General Curtis Lame assumes command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945, analyzing high-altitude daylight raid effectiveness with his characteristic intensity. Initial missions achieve poor accuracy due to the jetstream winds discovered at bombing altitude, sometimes exceeding 250 miles per hour. These winds, unknown before B-29 operations, push bombers rapidly across targets, making accurate bombing nearly impossible. Navigation proves difficult. While bombs drift miles from intended targets, regardless of bombardier skill, cloud cover frequently obscures targets during winter months, forcing radar bombing with minimal precision. The combination of factors means less than 10% of bombs hit intended targets. Lame faces pressure from Washington to produce better results. After analyzing the tactical situation, he implements a revolutionary change in March 1945, ordering low-altitude night incendiary attacks against urban areas. This decision transforms the air war over Japan. B-29s strip defensive armament except tail guns carrying maximum incendiary bomb loads. The altitude reduction from 30,000 feet to 5,000 to 9,000 feet eliminates the jetstream problem while bringing bombers within range of Japanese defenses. The tactical shift means Japanese fighters can suddenly achieve effective interception altitude, fundamentally changing combat dynamics. March 9, 1945 witnesses Operation Meeting House, the devastating Tokyo firebombing mission that reshapes strategic bombing doctrine. The attack force of 334 B-29s approaches at 5,000 to 9,000 feet altitude, finally within reach of all Japanese fighter types. Night conditions and the unexpected tactical change initially confused Japanese defenses. Lieutenant Yoshio Mitsuyoshi scrambles in his Nakajima Ki-84 from Matsudo Airfield, finally able to reach bomber altitude without difficulty. But night combat presents entirely different challenges. Without airborne radar or effective ground control, Japanese fighters struggle to locate targets in darkness. Searchlights illuminate individual bombers, while anti-aircraft guns engage at point-blank range for the first time. Ki-44s and Ki-61s conduct desperate single attacks without radio coordination or formation support. Mitsuyoshi achieves multiple firing passes against B-29s, observing hits on engine nacelles and fuselages. Several bombers stream flames and lose altitude, but most continue to their targets despite damage. The superfortresses demonstrate remarkable durability, absorbing tremendous punishment while proceeding to targets. Remote-controlled turrets engage attacking fighters with radar-directed fire in darkness, proving surprisingly effective. Japanese pilots trained for daylight combat struggle with night engagement techniques. The incendiary attack creates a firestorm consuming 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing an estimated 100,000 civilians in the deadliest air raid in history. Japanese fighters claim 14 B-29s destroyed, the highest toll of the war, but cannot prevent catastrophic damage to the capital. Low altitude enables interception, but overwhelming bomber numbers, night conditions, and the surprise tactical shift limit defensive effectiveness. The success of firebombing validates LAME's gamble, establishing a pattern for subsequent raids. The tactical shift invalidates Japanese high-altitude interceptor development programs that had been desperately pursuing solutions to the altitude problem. Resources devoted to high-altitude engine development and pressurization research become irrelevant overnight. Imperial Navy Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi flies the new Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden interceptor during B-29 raids over Nagoya in early 1945. The Raiden's supercharged CAS engine enables a 36,000 feet ceiling, theoretically sufficient to engage B-29s. But combat at extreme altitude proves nearly impossible even when fighters can reach bomber height. Controls barely respond while the engine produces minimal power despite supercharging. Pilots report inability to maintain pursuit curves or lead targets effectively in the thin air, even when reaching bomber altitude. Fighters lack performance for effective engagement. The Raiden requires perfect positioning before bomber arrival to attempt even a single firing pass. Climbing pursuit from below remains impossible once bombers pass overhead. Many pilots experience oxygen system failures causing disorientation or unconsciousness at altitude. The few successful interceptions occur against damaged stragglers descending from formation, not healthy bombers at operational altitude. April 1945 brings coordinated kamikaze attacks against B-29 formations. As conventional interception continues proving inadequate, the Japanese military formally organizes special attack units specifically targeting B-29s. Corporal Koshi Agawa successfully rams B-29 Torchi over Kawasaki on April 12. Both aircraft destroyed in the collision. This same day witnesses one of the most celebrated acts of heroism in B-29 operations. Staff Sergeant Henry Irwin earns the Medal of Honor when a phosphorus flare explodes prematurely in his aircraft. The device burns through Irwin's face and body, destroying his nose and blinding him. Despite horrific injuries, Irwin carries the flaming device through the bomber to the cockpit window, saving 11 crew members. His sacrifice exemplifies the courage shown by both sides despite the technological mismatch. Special attack units form at multiple bases with pilots volunteering for certain death missions against the Silver bombers. These ramming attacks achieve limited success, destroying perhaps 10 B-29s throughout the war, a tiny percentage of the bomber force. The psychological impact on American crews exceeds the tactical results, knowing that enemy pilots will deliberately ram their aircraft. Yet even successful ramming attacks cannot significantly impact the bombing campaign's effectiveness. The central fire control system on B-29s proves remarkably effective against Japanese fighters despite reduced gun positions compared to B-17s. Computer-controlled turrets track multiple targets simultaneously while gunners operate from pressurized compartments rather than exposed positions. Japanese pilots report unprecedented defensive fire accuracy with the automated system maintaining tracking even during